Hi everyone, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Kevin M. Gannon, historian and author of Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto today. It's the last podcast of season 3, and I could not have chosen a better book and person to be speaking with. This was recorded a little while ago during quarantine and touches on a number of important issues. It's really unbelievable how things have changed. My first interview of season 3 was with Kathleen Fitzpatrick about her book, Generous Thinking. That was August 2019, and since then, it is incredible how things have changed. In many ways for the worse, but I think we are also seeing, as Kevin would, I'm sure, say, some signs of hope and some inspiring stories as well. I hope that's what we can all dwell on, as opposed to the negatives, which are many. This interview is fairly wide-ranging, but ultimately covers the idea of what to do in 2020 and beyond when we are teaching in less than ideal circumstances, to say the least. Maybe you're a grad student working on a dissertation, maybe you are a teaching assistant, maybe you are a full professor, and maybe you're just interested in some of these discourses. Kevin's book, Radical Hope, was inspiring in many ways. I'm the chair of the Communication Studies department where I work. I bought this for all of the members of my faculty because I thought it was just such a great boost to think about while working on syllabi, while working on classes, and for many of us while planning, despite not knowing whether or not we would be in person or online or what would be happening. We've seen a lot of changes in the last few months, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more. I hope everyone is doing as well as they possibly can be during this time. As always, don't forget to check out tinapp.org. You can buy a coffee for the site. If you are enjoying what you're listening to, you can leave a review, or you can send an idea for books or authors you want to see covered. I really, really appreciate when people reach out like that. Also, you can check out everything you may have missed. It's hard to believe, but there have been more than 65 interviews so far, so lots of really great stuff with lots of amazing people, including Eisner Award winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, a host of just brilliant people I've been so fortunate to speak with. I hope you get a lot out of this, and I definitely encourage you to pick up Radical Hope. Kevin, thank you. I've been anticipating this interview for a while since I picked up your book. I was really, really happy to see it. I know you're getting so much attention right now, and well-deserved, of course. So you are a professor of history at Grandview University. You've also written for the Chronicle of Higher Ed. You've appeared in the Oscar-nominated documentary 13th. There's lots we can talk about. Let's start perhaps with the basic question of what Radical Hope was all about and what brought you to write it.
Well, it actually originated in a blog post that I wrote back in, I think it was spring of 2016. And I wrote the post because I'd had kind of a particularly difficult semester and had been wrestling with some things and kind of a vague sense of dissatisfaction. And, I started a blog to help develop my own writing practice, to have a place to get thoughts out there, even if it wasn't in any sort of formal academic sense. And so this seemed like something that I could kind of process through by writing. And so I went into some reflection and some reading at the end of this semester and thought it would be a good exercise for me to sort of clarify why I was doing this thing I was doing at a time when it didn't particularly seem like I'd made much of a difference. I was disappointed in a lot of ways with the way that semester had gone, and some things that were frustrating. So I wrote this post, and, again, it was really more for me than anything else, but it really kind of resonated and kind of took off in a lot of different places. And, then I was asked if, Jim Lang, who's the editor of the Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed series that this is published with, West Virginia University Press, reached out and said, hey, would you be interested in turning this into a book? And my first reaction was, well, this was a manifesto, and those aren't necessarily known for being very long. But then he reminded me the Communist Manifesto was published as a book. And so I said, all right, cool, you convinced me. And so I tried to expand on it. And what I tried to do is, I'm really influenced, as becomes immediately apparent reading any of my work, is, I'm really influenced by critical pedagogy, Paulo Freire, Henry Giroux, bell hooks, Peter McLaren, a lot of different theorists and thinkers from the sort of critical side of things. And one of the things that always resonated with me was Henry Giroux's argument that critical pedagogy needs to be more than just a language of critique. It also has to be what he calls a language of possibility. And so I think that connected with me at that particular moment because I was really into the language of critique part. I was very good at that, but it wasn't coupled to any sort of language of possibility. And then that sort of epiphany, if you will, helped me sort of figure out what my vague dissatisfaction was with some of the critical pedagogy that I've been reading is that, theoretically it sounded great, but what does it look like if you're an adjunct teaching 5 sections of Psych 101 across 2 different institutions, right? How do you put these things into practice in the very different circumstances that we're in? And so this book was an attempt to expand on the ideas of my original blog post manifesto, but with an eye towards answering that question. What does this look like in practice? Critique and possibility linked together. And that was sort of the guiding principle I had as I put this together.
Let's talk about the landscape that we're working in now, because, you start the book, and I think anyone even vaguely familiar with higher ed is aware of, in many cases, how bad it's become. I mean, bad in terms of finding meaningful work and possibilities for tenure track hires and funding and all of these things that we complain about all the time, even if we're one of the lucky few who are managing to stay in it. So where does hope come from in that case? And how do you begin to place yourself and others in a conversation with this sort of looming landscape of despair for many people?
Well, I think the reason that the landscape is such a despair-inducing thing right now is because we know how much better it could be. And so there's this misalignment, between what we know could be and what actually is. So we know that higher education can be an important social good. It can create the type of society in which we want to live. It can make positive change for the better. It can contribute to all of these projects that we think are important from not just a pedagogical, but from a larger social justice and political perspective. It can do all these things. And through the results of a series of choices that have been made, certainly over the last several decades, it is prevented from doing those things, which is really depressing when you first look at it, right? About 75% of the credit hours in higher ed are taught by adjunct or contingent faculties. Funding has been eviscerated. You have one of our 2 major political parties, a majority of which thinks that higher education is actually dangerous and not good for the country. So, we are at a point, a real critical point, a crisis point, but you can find hope in that in the same way that you're critiquing it. What I mean by that is, we know that where we are now is the product of a set of choices. And even though it's a bleak landscape, we can always make different choices. So how do we do that, right? First we have to ground our own practice in creating the type of world that we want to see. So when I say that teaching is a radical act of hope, what I mean is that in the everyday decisions that we make, all the way down to this root fundamental level, how we write our syllabi, how we approach our students outside of class, the things that we choose as course materials, all these routine, everyday, seemingly minor, inconsequential decisions we make actually add up to an accumulated weight of practicing from a certain ethic. We teach from certain stances. So what I'm arguing is that we need to own our stance and use that as the basis to affect real change. We teach despite all these things because we do believe it makes a difference. And so if we couple our actions consciously to that belief, what we start doing is advocating by practice. And that's where change begins.
Yeah. And I mean, you are an excellent advocate for hope, especially with this book and things that you've been doing. I'm wondering how you found the reception when you start talking about hope in higher ed. Like we just said, it can be not a very happy place for many people who may be not seeing what they want to see in terms of what's going on. So when you come and say, effectively, we need to have a place for radical hope. We need to start thinking about, I guess, making changes in what we can do. How have you found reception to that from especially professors, but maybe as well students, administrators, people involved in higher education, not necessarily directly?
So I think there's a general receptivity that I've found, but I do think there is this sort of bemused puzzlement on the part of some, like, things are really crappy right now, and you're coming in talking about hope. Who are you, Pollyanna? And that's a legit question, right? Because, it's very easy to sink into sort of like a Hallmark card platitude, like things will get better because things always get better. And so that sort of vague, disembodied hope, that actually puts the onus on other people. So that really dodges the question, I think. I think what's important for us, think of Rebecca Solnit and her famous essay, Hope in the Dark. She talks about hope not as a lottery ticket, but as an axe with which you break down the door in an emergency. And that's the sense that I think we need to be talking about hope, is a call to action, but with, a focus for our practice. So, because the opposite of it is despair. And so, we all have those colleagues who've sort of faded into cynicism. Nothing matters. My students suck. They can't write. I'm just here to collect retirement. That loss of hope does profound damage, not just to the individual, but to everyone who comes into contact with them in a classroom. And so, again, we teach from stances. What is our stance, and how do we own that stance in our practice? I choose to adopt a stance of hope.
Yeah. And so with that stance, do you have advice, based on the book for people maybe who haven't read it yet, about maybe where to start thinking about that? Maybe they are teaching a few classes, maybe they're, graduating from a PhD program or something. And on some level, like you discuss, there's this kind of collegial idea, like let's make fun of our students, or let's talk about the negatives, and just you're at this sort of threshold where you could go into despair and become one of these sort of bitter people. But like you said, you don't want to become a fully like a Pollyanna where it's just you try to look at everything with rose-tinted glasses. So in terms of the stance that you would, I guess, recommend when people start to self-reflect about these things, where to begin? What kind of questions should people start asking themselves?
I think it's really essential to be critically reflective in what we do. And that's a phrase I borrow from Stephen Brookfield, who wrote a book, oddly enough, called Being a Critically Reflective Teacher. That was a really big influence on me as I've been thinking about these things. What he means by that is, we should be constantly revisiting our practice, the choices we make, the things that we've done, all of these sorts of, ideas about that have informed our daily practice, and not be afraid to do that reflection critically. So what went well and what fell short? What will I change for the better? The same thing that we're asking our students to do. And the only way that we can put that into practice is if we really know why we're doing what we're doing. And that seems like such a simple point, but it's very easy to forget in the sort of day-to-day business that we're about in higher ed, whether it's committee meetings and paperwork and bureaucratic responsibilities, or whether it's commuting to different campuses or being just an hour ahead of students in our class prep. We do need, I think, to keep focused. Why are we doing this thing? What is it that we believe about the possibilities of what we're doing that keeps us doing those things? And from that, I think it's easy to move into a practice that embodies that ethic, that, that hopeful ethic, because it's informed by our own personal connection to the work.
Yeah, I think back to the growth of higher education in general, especially, around the world, but especially in America after the Second World War. A lot of people were, for the first time, getting post-secondary degrees or pursuing that kind of thing. And it seemed like everything was growing, everything was exciting and huge. And now it seems like things have changed dramatically with technology, with funding, like you said, with a number of other things. And then, of course, now, as I'm speaking with you, we have the coronavirus sweeping through the world and through America. You were mentioning before, you're one of the only states right now that doesn't have a shelter-in-place order, but we're all dealing with this. We're all pretty much teaching from home, or from, at least, through technology with our computers. Has your thinking changed with the recent events, especially maybe a year ago, even a few months ago, about what you might have answered to? Why are you doing this? What is sort of the point of teaching and getting in front of a bunch of students? Has that changed with the recent events?
I don't think it's changed substantially, but I think it's got a sharper edge, a more urgent edge to it. And what I mean by that is I teach because I think it makes a difference. And in particular, it makes a difference for students like, first generation students, or from lower socioeconomic status, or students that come from populations that have traditionally been very underserved by higher education. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as soon as our student body really began to diversify in those ways, we began to see a reluctance from states and the federal government to adequately fund higher ed, with the Reagan Revolution in the 80s, and the idea, that those people shouldn't be getting these things, right? We know that white Americans tend to not favor social programs if they know that those social programs benefit people of color, even if they would benefit those white people too, right? And what that does, that shows me that education has a lot of work to do. And even if it's being strangled or, people are attempting to strangle it, all that does is underscore the importance. Because what I think our current landscape shows us, again, is that, the product of the choices that have been made over the last 4 or 5 decades has been, has produced absolute disaster. And the coronavirus pandemic is the most stark illustration of that, because what it does is it throws in a very bold relief the disparities and the inequities and the injustices that already existed in terms of, disproportionate impact of the disease on communities of color and poor communities, for example, where we see the presidential administration dispensing aid to allies, but not to political enemies, right? Like, none of this is new. It didn't appear out of thin air, but it's thrown into very stark relief. And so one might think that that's a really weird place to find hope. But as a historian by training, one of the things that I think is essential to realize is that it's really hard to solve large, deep-seated problems if we're not adequately aware of the dimensions that those problems have. And so one thing that I think we can take from our current landscape is we understand now a lot of the things that certain critical voices have been pointing out, but had been largely ignored during, quote unquote, normal times. So in higher ed, for example, you have a lot of the sort of techno-utopian cheerleaders talking about, well, this app and this device is going to, save everything and make education more efficient. And, MOOCs can teach thousands of students and we can unbundle the campus and you don't need these things for a good higher ed experience. And now that we're all doing those things under really difficult circumstances, we're starting to see that, maybe all that cheerleading wasn't based in real life. The digital divide is a thing. Student access to technology, to high-speed internet, to all these things that are supposedly going to save higher education. Well, it turns out that landscape is really uneven. And now that personal experience with those uneven aspects, that's part of our individual faculty experience now. And we can't unring that bell. And so what I'm hoping is that, we're being shaken into an honest reckoning, not just in higher ed, but socially and politically as well. And for me, that's hope, even in times of despair.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that I think we've been learning as educators in the last few weeks, especially in terms of technology and in terms of, I guess, thinking about why we do things and then planning how to either disseminate knowledge, provoke critique, demonstrate hope, and all of these things. Obviously, they're happening in somewhat different ways than they were a month ago. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, though, for me, at least, I see these two extreme possibilities. I don't think either one is exactly going to happen. But on one hand, it seems like people funding these kinds of programs, states, federal government in some sense, and then local communities could simply look at this and say, look, everybody has managed to maintain the education system online. Why are we spending money on beautiful campuses with flowers and stuff when we can really just send people an email and then set up a Zoom conversation and all of this? So like on one hand, it seems like this could be used as a way to cut funding significantly, especially for physical places. On the other hand, maybe it's demonstrating the need to have people sort of in a room discussing things. And I could see potential arguments for why on campus is so much more important than people realize, because now without it, we've seen a lot of changes. What's your thinking on the future of where we might go and the kinds of arguments we might see in terms of funding or defunding the education system? Like, will conversation, I guess, move in a certain direction after this experience, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think it can't help but move in a different direction. And I think that the two poles that you've sort of laid out there are the competing endpoints of the spectrum, that we're going to be pulled in between. I think just judging from my email, I'm getting several messages a day. My capacity as faculty developer and leading a teaching center at my university, I'm getting several messages a day from people who have, built apps or, run this platform or this learning management system. And, this can help you in the times of COVID. And, there's definitely the element of kind of ed tech, capitalism, entrepreneurship that sees this as an opportunity, to continue this sort of online pivot. And then on the other end, I think what you're seeing is folks realizing that, hey, online teaching may be a thing, but it's not a thing that I'm really good at. And I'm starting to realize that it takes a lot of training and expertise and skill to do this right. I teach a lot online and have for years. And I've always argued that, online teaching isn't inherently better or worse than face-to-face. It's just different. But in that, that depends on context. We have to understand nuance. And there are some things that, you are better not taught online. There are some things in an asynchronous online format is not going to be the best for given the other alternatives that are out there. And so I'm really leery of the solutionism on either side of that spectrum that says it has to either be all this way or all the other. I think what we're really going to see, and this is coming from the faculty upwards, is, a recognition that without development, without support, and without resources, this is unsustainable. I mean, there was that sort of first 2 weeks where everyone was like, all right, we'll do this, kind of a rally around the flag effect, we'll make this work for our students. But now kind of reality is set in, and it's sort of thank God this only goes for a few more weeks because it sucks. Right. And, Zoom fatigue is a thing. We're starting to see the backlash of all, there was this sort of, we'll just put everything on Zoom and we'll have synchronous classes just like our students do. And, all those illusions kind of popped pretty quickly. And now we have to really kind of sort through what's left. And that story can't be lost. When things get back to whatever normal is, I would argue that we shouldn't be getting back to normal. We should be getting back to the way things ought to have been. And our experiences in this sort of emergency remote teaching will have a lot to offer us in terms of thinking about the way that things ought to have been.
A lot of what this book is about, Radical Hope, is, at least, from my summary, would be placing yourself in a situation or I imagine it in a room, but of course this can be online and everything, but placing yourself at a level sort of eye to eye with students and seeing sort of where they're coming from, allowing them to mature and grow as you, as a professor, mature and grow. Mm-hmm. Have you seen opportunities for that or challenges with that as things have changed, especially as certain things like you mentioned earlier, like if you're adjuncting 4 classes at 2-3 schools, it's very hard to be in the same situation as somebody who's, solid tenured position allows them to become more vulnerable in certain ways. But yeah, either before this crisis or during this crisis right now where most of us are online, have you seen ways for people to engage, I guess, with their students in ways that you were thinking about, I guess, a year or two ago when you were starting with this book?
Yeah, I think so. And, and as you point out, I think it's important to acknowledge our own positionality when we think about ways that we're making ourselves vulnerable or taking risks with students. As a tenured full professor, white male, that looks different for me than it does for, a young faculty member, woman of color, for example. But I do think that what this crisis has shown us is, the real need to come from a place of compassion and empathy, because now a lot of us are in the same place that some of our students have always been, in a sense that everything is different and we don't know what the hell is going on, right? I mean, and so, so we are in a very general sense, maybe we're starting to experience the terrain of higher education in the way that a first generation student might, for example, where there are all these things that have to be done and kind of a rough idea of the landscape, but you have no idea how to get from point A to point B, and you're reliant on the sort of patience and generosity of others to get there. And I think that that's been a really important experience. And one of the things that's really encouraged me is a lot of the sort of, whether it's on social media or, in Chronicle of Higher Ed and these other places, you see a lot of the articles and a lot of the sort of conversation rhetoric being around, now is not the time to be a jerk to your students, right? Like we need to understand, a lot of us have been saying these things for years, but again, what this crisis has done is throw those things into sharp relief and added urgency to the story. It's possible to be compassionate with your students. It turns out that a lot of the things that we assumed kind of had to be in place for education maybe don't. So now there are possibilities open before us. Let's reflect critically on, our assumptions about what goes into effective teaching and learning and see if any of those need to be revisited.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot, I think, that people are asking themselves now. Like you said, it's really interesting to see people posting on Twitter and other places that are basically saying that, I'm going to assume my students are in a place where they need help, that they're not lying to me. I'm not going to double check these things, which, I mean, you said in your book way before this was happening, the idea that, you need to prove that you were at a funeral or else I'm going to assume you're lying to me, is a way that a lot of professors, I guess, would treat their classes up until this crisis. And now a lot of people, which is odd because, you would think that earlier people would have also been generous, but I think this has brought out a lot more generosity in a sense. Right. To play devil's advocate a little bit, though, I'm just thinking about my own personal experience teaching. I know from talking to students that in some cases, students have family members who are working at hospitals who are very worried and who are understandably very busy and distraught in many ways. I also have students who are, at a beach house, probably playing video games or what have you. Is there a way to, I guess, maintain some kind of rigor, even though rigor, I think, is, a catchphrase that people use when they really mean to be strict or to be mean or something like that.
Right.
But I'm just thinking about, somebody's late or somebody doesn't do a very good essay. I don't necessarily know who is in a situation where they have, family members who are struggling with this virus and therefore their mind is in a different place, their time is in a different place versus people who are just kind of like, whatever, I'm going to pass because of all this craziness. I don't really want to do anything. Do you have any suggestions for professors as they sort of weigh students' responses to this as well?
So, I don't think as a professor with my students, and I have a class right now that has moved into emergency remote instruction, and I think my students are probably along the same spectrum that you point out. I've got a couple students who are back home in the Dominican Republic with no internet access other than a cell phone, and I've got students who are here in town just kind of hanging out, but I don't think it's my job to sort of police their motivations or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I think in this particular time, I think we need to understand that people are processing things differently. For students who have family members who are working in healthcare, or who have family members who are sick or maybe sick themselves, that's one thing, but I don't know if any of our students has the bandwidth to be doing the type of stuff that we would be doing in a normal semester, right? And so, I think, you use the example of, some student playing video games all day. I have played so much Mario Kart in the last 3 weeks because that's my way. I have figured out that that's my way to just unplug from everything and let my brain not process stuff for a while. And, I was good at Mario Kart before, but now I will take on anyone, I swear, so, and, I can do those courses in my sleep. What that gets to is, again, in these circumstances, I think it's better to err, much better to err on the side of kindness and compassion and just assume our students are going to be trying their best. That will look different depending on the students. And even there might be some students who are like, oh, okay, cool, I'm done. I'm passed. I'm just going to mail it in. You know what? The semester is the way things have gone. That's an understandable response too. I just think we need to be careful if we get into a place where we assume that given the opportunity to game the system, students will automatically do that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a very good narrative for us to have about our students, and it's certainly not a fair one in these times.
Yeah, definitely. Just to follow up on that then, if let's say, a few students are giving essays that if you were to be as objective as possible, you would just say these are very bad. Like these don't pass certain criteria or what have you. Do you have any advice for professors who, they obviously want to be fair and give an A to an A-worthy paper and what have you, but there is all this craziness going on. Do you have any advice for people thinking, like weighing basically, do I give what I would call a fair grade or do I just pass everybody? And this especially for places where I know some places have gone to a pass-fail system that makes things maybe easier when answering a question like this. But how do you maintain sort of compassion for students, but also, I guess, stick to some kind of normalcy in terms of expectations?
Well, it's interesting to bring this question up because, for those folks who have talked about the approach of ungrading, what we've really seen in the last few weeks is that, grades are certainly not an objective measure of what students have done. I'm really influenced by research from people like Sia Sheldon, who talks about bandwidth theory. It originally comes out of research on poverty, where it talks about what are our cognitive resources that are available for us to draw upon, especially in times of acute anxiety or stress. Mm-hmm. And if students don't have the full range of cognitive resources, bandwidth, if you will, to draw upon, what's their work going to look like? And are they going to be penalized because of the circumstances that they're doing the work in or the work itself? And so, I'm not going to see the type of, research papers that I could expect to normally see in a normal semester, but I'm not in a normal semester. So I have to kind of shift my frame of reference. And the question that I need to ask myself as I evaluate student work is, what are the learning outcomes for this assignment now? And how well did the student get towards meeting them? And even if they didn't meet them fully, what parts of the process can I identify here? And for me, it's almost the process is the outcome. In other words, was a student doing things, and maybe not as well or skillfully as they could have in normal times, but what am I seeing in terms of the thinking and the learning that's going on? And that's what I really want to affirm and acknowledge. And that's what's having me rethink, the approach to grades and assessment in these times.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all learning on the fly much more so than we would normally. You also, in the book talk about setting expectations that a professor doesn't know everything and no professor knows everything, but also it may be worthwhile to show students where, I guess, your weaknesses or failures might be, so that you show that failing in the sense of not knowing something or not succeeding first time around is actually a good way to learn. I mean, it's how we learn.
Yeah.
Do you see that coming up in situations like we've been facing now? And are there examples, I guess, of how you might see that in practice today?
Oh, for sure. And so a lot of the colleagues at my own institution, one of the first things they did was reached out to their students when we came off of spring break into this new online environment. So before we left for spring break, everything was quote unquote normal, but then the university shifted all its classes online over spring break. So we had time to ramp up and prepare, right? So the first thing faculty colleagues did was reach out to students. And what a lot of my colleagues did, which I thought was both genuine and ethically right, but also effective, was, I'm not experienced in teaching this way. So we're going to be trying some tools. Here's what they are. I'm not quite sure what this is going to look like, but I need your help in making it work, right? And so again, we're all in the same boat here. Has sort of been dramatically illustrated, if you will, and a real opportunity for us to kind of own things, that put us in a position of modeling the learning process for our students. I told my own students, I'm an experienced online teacher, but this course that's moving online was not designed to be online. So we're going to have to change a lot of things. And I want your input as I throw some ideas out there for you to see if these things are going to work. Right. And so inviting students to be a part of that process, to collaborate with us, as they understand that, nobody signed up to do things like this, and collaboration and honest exchange of ideas might be the best way to navigate it.
You give a lot of great advice in this book that people can further explore if they haven't read it yet. But as we move forward, I guess, with assessing the impact of what we've discovered in the last year, of also trying to get to work on maybe instilling or evoking radical hope in ourselves and in others in higher education, are there things you think that should change? Like, assuming we go back to normal in the fall, which we may very well not be, I'm not sure. And I'm just, for the record, recording this on April 10th. But
right.
But yeah, so assuming, let's just say everything is sort of settled and people go back to campus, are there things that you see especially relevant now that we can change? Maybe easily, maybe it won't be so easy, but what would the fall campus look like to you in terms of setting up classes and engaging students?
Well, I think that we'll see, I hope that we see it. I think that we will see a lot of renewed appreciation for just, what this enterprise of teaching and learning is all about, because we're having to do it in ways for many of us right now don't feel very authentic. And I think there's a real grieving process. We've lost some of the things that we had over the semester, and now we have things that are not nearly as good. So an appreciation for that. But I think also, what we take out of this is a renewed appreciation of flexibility, of compassion for students. I really hope that, as we talked a little bit about earlier, or at least touched on, I really hope we see a critical approach to the way that we think about things like rigor and challenging students, not hazing, but challenging with support, and how important are some of the things that we believe are important parts of our practice. And what I also hope is that we understand just how important early career and in particular adjunct and contingent faculty have been here. A lot of these faculty members are being asked to essentially develop completely different courses without extra compensation. And if you look at, larger universities or even smaller places like mine, without our adjunct faculty doing a lot of this work, a lot of our service courses, our core curriculum courses, our intro courses just go down in the tank.
Yeah.
So I think, that's something that people like me who are in more secure positions really need to keep in front of those who are making budgets and signing checks, even though we will likely be in a tough financial environment. I think what we have learned is, the importance of faculty in these positions and the profound injustice of keeping them in that position while their work has been demonstrated to be so essential.
Yeah, definitely. And I think these are, of course, important conversations that people have been having, and I think will become more crucial as things go into the future and what looks to be, really, really dangerous economic times for a lot of us, if not, all of us are connected in many ways, which makes me think about earlier earlier meeting before the whole virus and everything, I think it's common in most schools to effectively recruit students by saying, look, if you're paying 40 grand, 50 grand, or whatever ridiculous price tag we offer, you get this wonderful experience. You get all of these amenities. You get all of this great stuff. A lot of schools have, obviously gone online, and all of the great amenities are gone. And in some cases, they're giving refunds, and, it varies from school to school. But I'm just thinking, does it still make sense to tell students that you should put together enough money to bankrupt them in many cases to get a 4-year degree? Like, can we maintain the narrative, in your opinion, that schools have been maintaining for a while, which is, it's totally worth 40 grand a year because of all of these things, when it seems like you could just, again, on one side of the conversation, you could just go online, get this way cheaper.
Right. And so, as someone who teaches at a private university,
me too,
with students who are, trying to, we've been having this conversation with students and their families already.
Yeah.
But I think it's become even more urgent now, right? Because it is a compelling narrative to say, well, it turns out that maybe all this stuff isn't essential to higher education. I think the schools that will be able to have that conversation successfully are the ones that have had teaching and learning at the heart of that experience and intentionally framed it that way, right? So that, we have a beautiful campus and nice residence halls and athletics and all of these things, but really at the heart of what we're doing are, small class sizes and committed faculty and a teaching-oriented culture. Those are still the heart of what a college experience should be about. And so schools that have made that part of their ethos, I think, will navigate this a little more successfully. And I don't think the value of higher education in terms of its importance has ever been higher. Clearly we're at a point in society now where a lot of the systems in place are proving to be woefully inadequate to the needs of the community. So who revisions that? Who rebuilds that? That's what we need to be educating for.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking this story's been going on for a while, but it used to be, for particularly sort of baby boomer generation, you could get a low-paying job for the summer, which would pay for your school because of the way that funding was going from states and from federal government, from other places where, you could effectively get a job for the summer, pay for school. Now we're asking, in many cases, students to go into debt for probably 10 years or so, at least. Does it get to a sort of breaking point? Because more and more I'm thinking, if there is a breaking point, I guess, in our current situation, it's happening right now, where people are really asking, is education worth it? And I'm sure if you and I were sitting together just talking about education, generally speaking, ethically speaking, of course it's worth it. Like, you want to develop critical thinking skills. You want to develop the ability to, form nuanced and solid arguments and all these kinds of things. But particularly for people who are, struggling to pay whatever their tuition is this possibly a tipping point or a breaking point?
I think it could be. I think one of the opportunities for higher education that has been woefully underutilized is the realization that students and their families, their parents, should be our allies in this conversation where we talk about, public financing for higher education, whether it's institutional funding or financial aid. Because as you point out, the baby boomer generation could work a summer job and pay 4-year tuition at Yale. Now you can't do that. But there's still this narrative in larger society that ends up in this place like education's too expensive, it's not worth it because you can't work a summer job to pay it anymore. Well, we never talk about why that is and the choices that have been. We should be sharing with parents and students, like, yes, tuition is high. Yes, there are ways that we can help finance and get you through this, but it shouldn't have to be this kind of choice. And so as you journey through higher education, think about this when you vote, and think about this, with your state and local government, not just national government. This. University of California used to be tuition free, and now it's not. And I think one of the things that we're seeing as this conversation accelerates is because of state universities moving more and more to tuition increases to make up for shortfalls in funding. We need to share the process of why that is, and we need to enlist our allies in pushing back against that, because right now what the public sees is all these universities and professors are just grubbing for more money from the government. Well, no, it's actually more money for you. So let's talk. Because there's no reason that this education should not be accessible to everyone, regardless of cost.
Again, if you take a big picture perspective and think about, do you want an educated populace? Do you want a democratic society where people can weigh arguments well, as opposed to, fall for fallacies and other things, then that makes absolute perfect sense. There's also, the year-to-year budgets that, I mean, if you're in, like, I'm in rural Georgia, right? I think my county is something like 99% Republican, not particularly interested in socialized programs, which you might call them, where students can, where effectively the community can help students pay for their tuition or other things of that nature, right? So there's like an immediate, yes, you should get this education because you can make more money or what have you. And then there's like the big picture question, which is, what kind of society do you want to live in? I'm worried, I guess, that with a crisis like this, the big picture stuff gets kind of pushed out the window, even though it shouldn't be. Do you see sort of ways of combating that to stop it from becoming a sort of myopic, what am I going to get this year? I don't care about the big picture sort of ethical questions of an educated society.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know if I have any answers to that, but I think, we're seeing the results of our sort of denigration of education over the decades play out again with deadly consequences now. Mm-hmm. And I am seeing a kind of like, there is a sort of undercurrent of, hey, maybe expertise isn't bad. Maybe the pointy-headed elites do know something about like epidemiology, for example. Or, so what are the consequences of not having a society that values education? Well, as it turns out, we get this. I think the education debate is in many ways parallel to the healthcare debate. Should this be a privilege or should it be a right? I think it should be a right. And so how do you frame this as, why should somebody who basically won the genetic lottery and was born into affluent circumstances have access to all of these other things just because of that you ordinary people don't get? Do we want a society that's built on essentially a role of the birth lottery? And we don't. And nobody would say that people probably would say that we do, and some of them are actually the government, I guess. But I think that's what we need to be asking, hammering and pounding on the table and really putting in front of people and having, I think as institutions, it's so hard to do, but we need to have conversations with our students and parents and communities about like, look, nobody wants to charge $40,000 a year. Here's why we have to do it. And here's what we give in return for that, but there have to be more sustainable ways to provide what we do for a larger swath of the population, that we can't be turning people away just because of money. Do we want to live in a world that does that? And if not, then how do we undo the choices that have been made? It's certainly not an easy or short-term process, but that has to be the conversation that drives this.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think there's definitely been a turn with your work with, I was thinking of Generous Thinking with Kathleen Fitzpatrick and a number of other places. Yeah, I mean, a number of places are opening this conversation. A number of authors are opening this conversation about not showing that what we do is criticize everything in a negative way. What we are also doing is providing sort of generous thinking, hope, ideas about moving forward in productive ways. So what are the best ways to do that, to move forward, to not become sort of, Pollyannas where everything is wonderful, but also to not be sort of seen as the doom and gloom of what critical theory might be, for example?
Yeah. Well, as someone who loves critical theory, this is a important question for me. I think Fitzpatrick's book, it gets at that pretty well. Mm-hmm. What I took out of reading that book was, not just this emphasis on what she terms as generous thinking, but a real need for us institutionally in higher education to be much more transparent and much less, we need to change our narratives in higher education as well about how we interact with public, the community, prospective students, governance, et cetera. We haven't always been our own best advocates here. Mm-hmm. And so what does a college or university do? How do we do it? Why do we do it? We need to be much more transparent about that, not just with, people we might call the stakeholders, but just the general public as well, to help, propagate to move beyond these sort of shallow caricatures. Even folks who, I referred earlier to the Republican Party, the majority of Republicans seeing that higher education was actually not good for the country, a poll that was taken about a year ago. Mm-hmm. But yet they still think that their own kids need to go to college, right? So how do we get across that gap? How do we get them to understand that, what you're seeing in your personal context is also really important for us as a society? And for me, what that involves is, colleges and universities being better partners with the community, engaging different aspects of the population, not just prospective students, and really showing that we are a common good, that we are an imperative social good. That's going to look different depending on the campus. But I think there's a lot of opportunities there that some institutions have really effectively utilized and other institutions have ignored. But I think that's the direction we need to be going.
Yeah. And in terms of scholarship, especially about teaching and learning, I mean, it seems like I've just, vaguely kind of monitored the responses on Twitter and other places about Radical Hope. And it seems like a lot of people just really wanted a book like this and are very happy to see a book like this because it does, sort of what it says, right? It provides radical hope in a sense, especially at a time where people are very worried, very negative, very, in many cases, unhappy with the higher education system. What else needs to be done? I mean, not just necessarily by you, although I hope obviously you keep writing and doing the kind of work you're doing. But after I sort of maintain the ideas that you put forward in Radical Hope, if we're able to do that, what else needs to be done in terms of thinking about researching higher ed?
Great question. I think we need to continue our efforts to put students at the center and student learning at the center of what we're doing. I think a lot of standard practice is, well, I'm going to quote unquote teach, and if the students learn, great, but if they don't, it's not my fault. I don't think that's the sustainable way forward. So I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to things like pedagogy, to methods and techniques and what, evidence-based strategies that show us or that we know are more effective for learning. I think we need to continue to be very intentional about centering those practices, and institutions need to value those practices as well. So a renewed emphasis on teaching and learning as the heart of the institution's mission, even if it's an R1 institution or something like that, teaching and learning has to be at the center of it, because otherwise you're sending a message about the ends of knowledge that you might not want to send. Right. So if passing on that knowledge is not important to you, then what is? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. We need to create the type of academic community that we want our students to model in other contexts after they leave our campuses. Right. So how do we treat junior colleagues? Are we inclusive? Are we welcoming? Do people genuinely belong? Do we model equity? Are we taking intentional efforts to undermine and to subvert the systemic inequities in the communities around us? If we're not showing that, then anything that we say about diversity or inclusion is going to ring hollow for our students.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, the way forward is to put into practice the things that are often just boilerplate on our admissions view books, to live our missions and to involve our students as active partners and collaborators in doing that, not just passive spectators.
Yeah, no, and I think that is super important, of course. I guess when I read Radical Hope and a few other books this year, I've sort of felt reinvigorated. I want to go into the classroom or approach my students in a way that, really kind of takes things to a new level. But then I have a meeting and it's like, your travel funding is canceled this year because of budget cuts. We're closing this program because of budget cuts or what have you. I mean, we all face this kind of thing in most situations. How do you maintain sort of level of hope, even if it's not maybe 100% all the time? What advice do you have for people who are, even if they mentally sort of really get a lot out of this book and go into their classroom and feel reinvigorated, there's still this environment that we talked about earlier, right? So how do we maintain a sort of level of hope and inspiration?
Well, I think you bring up an important point. It's not possible to have a full tank all the time.
Yeah.
Right. Because then we're just lying to ourselves. And so I think, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to even sort of despair once in a while without falling into it as a permanent state. And for me, what that looks like is, I'm at a small budget challenged university in an increasingly bleak higher ed landscape in a state that is losing college age students. So we're not getting out of this anytime soon. I wish the landscape was a lot different, but I can control right now the landscape in my classroom, either real or virtual, and with my students. And I have to believe, because I've seen this in process, that when my students get out of that and get into whatever the next chapters in their lives are, that difference has been made, and that the way they operate, or the way, the paths that they choose to go down, are choices that were shaped by their experience either with me or at my university. So sometimes it's, what can I control right in front of me? And what is the piece of the larger puzzle? I can only see the one piece. I can't see the larger puzzle. But it's the cliche of the power of one, right? If enough people are making those decisions, the sum total of those decisions is going to be pretty significant. And I think that's what we have to sort of keep in mind. This is, we're in the seed planting business. We may not see the growth, but we have planted seeds, and that challenges our patience and that challenges our resilience. But what's the alternative? What if we go forward from a place of despair? Then we're not doing anything.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess as we start to wrap up this conversation in particular, what conversations do you want to see happening more of? I guess in relation to this, perhaps in relation to maybe some of the things that you've pointed out in your book. I think this book in particular, of course, can spark a lot of great conversations. But what do you hope, or what would you suggest people interested in these topics, interested in pursuing further these ideas from Radical Hope? What do you want to hear them talking about? What are you hoping that they might bring to the table?
I want to hear more conversations about why we do what we do. And I try to start some of those in the book, even from mundane things like why do our syllabi look the way that they do? Why do we have time exams? Why do we assign certain types of research papers? I think it's really worth sort of peeling back a lot of the layers that have accumulated over time as sort of the commonsensical, this is the way things are. I think it's long past time for a systemic revisitation of those practices. And that's not to say we get rid of them all, but I don't think we have good answers as to why we do the things we do. I think our particular historical moment provides us with an opportunity to ask those questions in a way that really approaches the root nature of our practices because of the environment that we're in. Why are we doing the things that we do? And if we don't like the answer, or if we can't come up with a good answer, then what do we do instead? That for me, I think that's the most important thing that we should be doing going forward is applying this, this studied critical reflection that we want our students to be doing all the time, right? That it's time for us to model that on the individual faculty level, the department level, and the institutional level.
Yeah. And I think, everyone who picks this up, I think, is going to ask those kind of questions, which I really do love, because there are certain things, especially with the pandemic that we've seen, that are probably just not necessary. It's just that we've been doing them for 20 years, 30 years, or what have you. And so therefore, it gives us a lot of stuff to, I guess, reconsider. And before any of this happened, while I still had a departmental budget myself as chair, I made sure to buy a copy of this for everybody in my department, at least, so that we would have those conversations and hopefully form some new stuff. What else are you working on in the future that may or may not be related to this? What are your sights set on moving forward?
Well, right now, a lot of my time is, of course, occupied with online teaching and learning and, going after some questions, but, questions that are trying to be grounded in a similar sort of ethic, that it's clear that online learning is going to be a thing. Certainly not in the universal scale that it is now, but we have a lot to learn about how to do that much better than we have been. So let's have those conversations about what we need to do it better, to do it well for students, because I do believe that online learning is at root an access issue, and it does increase access to higher ed. But if we don't have access to something meaningful, then the access really means nothing. So a lot of my thinking and some short writing and faculty development work is centered there. I'm also working on a textbook project. I'm trained as a U.S. historian. I'm writing a textbook for the Civil War and Reconstruction era, mostly as a response to my dissatisfaction with the extant textbooks, but also one that is going to be, I think, taking some sort of bold pedagogical leaps, being very explicit with students from the introduction forward about the theoretical lens that it's informed by, about how historians, present and interpret history, about the problematic ideas that we have about things like objectivity. And so it's going to be a textbook that invites students into that process from the very first page. And so, peeking under the hood, having an invitation to collaborative thinking much more than just here are the way things happened that normal textbooks do. So I'm excited to be working on that, sort of on hold right now while we get through the rest of this semester. But that's one of my longer term projects. And then, continuing to think and write about higher ed policy, places, where the higher ed landscape, needs that kind of critical reflection. How are some ways that those questions that we're asking in higher ed, how might those inform or shape larger political and economic debates that we're having as a country? So, a lot to keep me busy, that's for sure.
Well, and I look forward to the stuff that you're working on now that hopefully we'll see in the not too distant future. And I'm sure a lot of us are on pause in many respects of what we're doing. I'm wondering, actually, last question then, with the feedback that you've received, with the discussions I'm sure you've had and continue to have with people who have read this teaching manifesto, have you had any interesting feedback that you care to share, like maybe ideas you hadn't thought of or suggestions that maybe in the next book or whatever, you might be able to include it because you didn't in this one?
Oh, that's a great question. A lot of what I've been hearing is a sense of, okay, these are all great ideas, but how do I convince people around me? Like, I'm all in, but how do we affect institutional cultural change? And so I think one of the things that was tough about this is focusing on like our own individual ethic and practice, but also thinking about where that fits into systems. And that's a tough question, right? So how do we affect institutional change if you're not a secure faculty member? Questions that I tried to address in the book, but I think are still very much open questions. One of the things that has gratified me is, I've had folks who've reached out or emailed or DM'd me on Twitter and said, I was in a place where I was about ready to just kind of quit all of this, but now I'm a little re-energized and I've got some things that I want to try. So thanks for that. And that, for me, is, the highest praise, right? Because I was in a place like that with the genesis of this book. And so to have that sort of effect is really gratifying. I think for next steps in terms of thinking about, where some of the things in this book go, though, I think an even larger focus on institutions and, how systemic change and how do we get the sum total of individual pedagogical stances informing larger university policy? How does my university's day-to-day operating policy match the ethic of those of us who are teaching day-to-day in the classroom? How might we bring those into closer alignment? Those are some of the questions I think that still need some work.
Yeah, for sure. But I think one of the best things about Radical Hope Teaching Manifesto is really the fact that everyone who seems to read this passes it on. And I think it's spreading, and those ideas and those conversations are spreading. And so it's a really great thing to see, especially when sometimes Radical Hope doesn't seem very easy to come by. So right. Yeah, I really appreciated reading it and then talking to you, of course, today. So thank you so much, Kevin. I really did get a lot out of this.
Well, thanks. And I'm genuinely, honored and humbled that people are passing it around and sharing and discussing and reflecting. I mean, it's I'm so glad the book is resonating, and I'm deeply appreciative of folks reading it and taking some of its ideas to heart.
As always, thank you so much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. This is the last episode of Season 3. I will be back in the fall, starting with Season 4, and I will have a host of excellent writers and thinkers. I've already lined up a number of them. I really look forward to sharing those interviews with you and for conducting them, some of which I'll do in the summer. In the meantime, don't forget to check out tinapp.org, where you can see all of the other interviews that have gone on. I've been so fortunate to talk to people from Pulitzer Prize winners to Eisner Award winners to just brilliant, thoughtful people in so many different disciplines, whether that's philosophy, psychology, critical theory, criminology. There's so many people I've been really fortunate to speak with. I really appreciate people listening to this podcast and letting other people know about the podcast, whether that's by writing a review, retweeting, what have you. You can always contact me and give me ideas about who you want to hear from, what kind of things you want to see. As I said, this will be the last podcast until the fall, but there will be a secret podcast released perhaps in the summer, as well as a number of kind of cool apps that I've been working on that I'll release through the website at tinapp.org. So until next time, thank you again for listening. I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.